Did medieval nuns just pray all day, locked away from the world? Were they always sad, forced into a life they never wanted during the Middle Ages? Prepare to unravel the untold stories of these fascinating women, often misunderstood, whose lives stretched across centuries from the 5th to the 15th centuries. Number 1. Nunneries were places of strict repression, with no joy or creativity. The popular understanding often paints a bleak picture of medieval nunneries, suggesting they were grim, silent places devoid of any personal expression or simple pleasures. This image of unending solemnity, where women lived under a constant cloud of rigid rules and severe discipline, is far from the whole truth, missing the vibrant spirit and rich inner lives that thrived within cloistered walls. Many communities, though certainly bound by religious vows and a structured daily routine, found abundant avenues for joy, for profound human connection, and for spectacular bursts of creativity that continue to amaze us centuries later. The very notion that joy was absent fundamentally misunderstands the human spirit, even one dedicated to a spiritual path, and it overlooks the vast evidence of profound artistic and intellectual flourishing that made these spaces far more dynamic than often portrayed. One of the most striking refutations of this idea comes through the sheer volume and exquisite quality of art and music produced within medieval nunneries. These institutions were not just centers of prayer. They were powerhouses of artistic creation. Nuns were skilled artisans, often contributing significantly to the visual splendor of their own sacred spaces and beyond. They engaged in magnificent needlework, creating intricate tapestries, altar cloths, and vestments that were not merely functional but works of breathtaking beauty, often employing threads of gold and silver pearls and precious stones. The skill required for such embroidery was immense, demanding patience, precision, and an eye for design that transformed humble threads into spiritual masterpieces. These works were not just isolated projects. They were often collaborative efforts, bringing sisters together in shared creative endeavor, fostering a sense of community and shared purpose that itself brought a deep satisfaction. The very act of creation was a form of devotion, a way to beautify God's house and honor the divine. But it was also a deeply personal and often joyful expression of artistic talent. Beyond textiles, nuns were instrumental in the creation of illuminated manuscripts, those glorious books filled with vibrant colors and intricate designs. While many scribes were male monks, convents often had their own scriptoria where nuns copied texts, not just religious ones, but classical works and scientific treatises as well. Art of illumination, adding painted miniatures, decorated initials, and ornate borders to the text, was a highly specialized and esteemed craft. These women mixed their own pigments, prepared vellum pages, and carefully applied gold leaf, transforming simple words into glittering works of art. The famous example of Herod of Lamsberg, Abbess of Hohenberg Abbey, in the 12th century, stands as a testament to this creative fervor. She oversaw and largely authored the Hortus Delicarum, or Garden of Delights, an encyclopedic manuscript compiled for the education of her nuns. This massive work, though tragically destroyed in a fire in 1870, is known through copies and descriptions to have contained over 1,100 illustrations, many of them exquisite and original, depicting theological, philosophical, and literary themes. The creation of such a monumental work speaks volumes about the intellectual curiosity and artistic freedom fostered within her community, demonstrating a joy in knowledge and beauty that transcended the strictly utilitarian. Music was another central pillar of convent life, offering immense opportunities for both spiritual devotion and creative expression. The singing of the divine office, the daily cycle of prayers and psalms, filled the convent churches with harmonious sound. Nuns were not passive recipients of liturgical music. They were active participants, often composing their own chants, hymns, and even full musical dramas. The unparalleled genius of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess from Germany, provides a shining example of this musical creativity. She composed an extensive body of sacred music, including antiphons, responsories, and a morality play, Ordo Virtutum, or Play of the Virtues, which is considered one of the earliest surviving examples of musical drama. Her compositions are characterized by their soaring melodies, wide vocal ranges, and profound spiritual depth, often using unique and evocative poetic texts that she herself wrote. The act of composing, performing, and listening to such intricate and beautiful music undoubtedly brought immense spiritual and aesthetic satisfaction to the nuns, fostering a sense of shared purpose and upliftment that transcended mere duty. The very existence of such complex musical works, requiring trained voices and a deep understanding of harmony and melody, demonstrates a vibrant artistic environment where talent was not just tolerated but encouraged. Beyond formal artistic pursuits, medieval nunneries fostered environments where personal expression and human connection flourished. Community life, while structured, was not devoid of laughter, shared stories, and deep friendships. Letters exchanged between nuns, or between nuns and their family members and patrons, often reveal a warmth and intimacy that contradicts the image of cold repression. These letters speak of shared meals, of gardens tended with care, of little joys found in daily routine, and of the comfort found in sisterly bonds. Nuns lived, worked, and prayed together, forming a close-knit family, and within this family, individual personalities and quirks found their place. Feast days were particularly important occasions, breaking the monotony of the regular liturgical calendar. These were days of celebration, often marked by special foods, perhaps slightly relaxed rules, and opportunities for communal joy. Even within the cloister, a sense of festive spirit and communal cheer would have permeated the atmosphere, offering a release from the more serious aspects of spiritual discipline. Moreover, while communal life was central, many nuns had private cells, or small living quarters where they could retreat for personal contemplation, study, or even quiet recreation. These personal spaces offered a degree of autonomy and privacy that allowed for individual interests and a sense of personal ownership. Accounts sometimes mention nuns having small gardens to tend, keeping pet birds, or even dogs, bringing a touch of the outside world and a source of simple companionship into their lives. These small allowances speak to a recognition of human needs for comfort, for connection, and for a touch of individual joy, demonstrating that medieval nunneries, while focused on spiritual development, were not entirely devoid of earthly comforts or simple pleasures. The strictures were often balanced with an understanding of human nature, allowing for moments of respite and personal fulfillment that softened the edges of monastic rigor. The life within the cloister was certainly disciplined, but it was also a life rich in meaning, purpose, and often profound personal and communal satisfaction. A stark contrast to the common misconception of unceasing joyless repression. Number 2. Nuns were exclusively from wealthy aristocratic families. Popular narrative often suggests that joining a medieval nunnery was a privilege reserved solely for the daughters of the highest nobility, a sort of spiritual finishing school for aristocratic women who could afford the hefty dowries required for admission. This misconception implies a uniform social stratum within convent walls, presenting a picture of an elite insular world cut off from the broader society from which it purportedly originated. However, historical evidence paints a much more nuanced and diverse picture, revealing that medieval nunneries were far from exclusive preserves of the wealthy elite. While aristocratic daughters certainly found places within these institutions, women from a variety of social backgrounds, including the burgeoning middle-class gentry, and even women of more humble origins, also found their way to the cloister, sometimes through different routes and with different expectations. The social composition of medieval nunneries was considerably more varied than the narrow aristocratic stereotype allows, reflecting the complex social tapestry of the medieval world itself. It is true that many prominent abbeys, particularly those with significant landholdings and royal patronage, did indeed attract and sometimes even preferentially admit daughters of noble and royal families. For these families, placing a daughter in a prestigious convent could be a strategic move, preserving family wealth by avoiding a large marriage dowry or ensuring her spiritual well-being and social standing in a respected institution. Such convents, often known as noble convents or stift, sometimes required significant entrance fees or dowries in the form of land, money, or goods, which naturally limited access to those with considerable resources. These institutions could offer their residents a life of relative comfort, access to education, and a respected social status, albeit within the confines of monastic discipline. Daughters of dukes, counts, and even kings and queens were regularly found within the walls of these grand establishments, and their presence certainly reinforced the perception of convents as elite institutions. However, a closer look at the vast network of medieval nunneries reveals a far more diverse landscape. Not all convents were equally wealthy or prestigious, and many smaller, more localized institutions served different segments of society. The growth of towns and the rise of a merchant class during the High Middle Ages, for example, led to the establishment of convents that catered to the daughters of prosperous burghers and merchants. These women, while perhaps not aristocratic, possessed significant wealth and contributed to the convent's financial stability, securing their place within the religious community. For a merchant's daughter, joining a convent could offer a respected alternative to marriage, providing an opportunity for education, spiritual development, and a stable, secure life that might not have been available to her in the same way outside the cloister. The social networks formed within these convents also served to solidify the connections between the growing urban elite, demonstrating a different kind of strategic placement that was not purely aristocratic. Furthermore, the concept of a dowry for entrance into a convent was not universally applied, nor was it always a barrier for women of more modest means. While some convents did require substantial contributions, others were more flexible, accepting smaller donations or allowing women to contribute through their labor or skills. Some orders, particularly those emphasizing poverty or service, actively sought to admit women from less privileged backgrounds. For example, the mendicant orders, like the Poor Clares, established in the 13th century, initially attracted women across a broader social spectrum, though over time some branches of these orders also became more selective. The very idea of monastic life was open to those with a genuine spiritual calling, and for many women, regardless of their social standing, the convent offered a path to piety and salvation that transcended worldly distinctions. Moreover, women from less affluent backgrounds sometimes entered convents in various capacities that could eventually lead to full monastic profession. Some might have entered as conversi or lay sisters performing manual labor and domestic duties, and in some cases, these women might later have been able to take full vows, particularly if they demonstrated exceptional piety or valuable skills. Others might have entered as oblates, children dedicated by their families to the convent at a young age, with their future path often depending more on the family's piety and the convent's needs than on a hefty financial contribution. In addition, women whose families could not afford a traditional dowry for marriage might have found a convent to be a viable alternative, particularly if a local patron or a more lenient convent offered a way in without prohibitive financial demands. For these women, the convent offered security, community, and a purpose, a life distinct from the often precarious existence of unmarried women in secular society, regardless of their financial background. The presence of diverse social strata within nunneries is also evidenced by the hierarchical structures sometimes found within larger institutions. While the abbess might often come from a noble family, reflecting her leadership role and the convent's connections, other positions such as those in charge of the infirmary, the kitchen, or the gardens might have been filled by women from more modest backgrounds chosen for their practical skills and dedication rather than their lineage. This internal division of labor and responsibilities further illustrates the varied composition of the community. Cards from various convents, such as those from the Benedictine nunneries in England or the Dominican convents in Germany, show a mix of names and origins ranging from aristocratic surnames connected to Powan names indicative of gentry, merchant, or even peasant origins. This diversity, while sometimes creating internal social dynamics, fundamentally challenges the monolithic image of convents as exclusively aristocratic enclaves. The medieval nunnery, therefore, was not a single socially homogeneous institution, but rather a spectrum of communities that collectively welcomed or provided opportunities for women, from a surprising range of social and economic positions, making the widespread belief in their aristocratic exclusivity a significant misrepresentation of history. Number 3. Nuns were all unwillingly cloistered, forced into it. Persistent image of medieval women being forcibly cloistered, condemned to a life behind convent walls against their will, remains one of the most enduring and poignant misconceptions about medieval nuns. This narrative often casts the convent as a dumping ground for unwanted daughters, for those deemed unmarriageable, or for women whose families wish to avoid the cost of a marriage dowry. It paints a picture of a life of involuntary servitude, devoid of personal agency or genuine spiritual calling. However, a deeper examination of historical records and social contexts reveals a far more complex reality, one where women frequently made conscious choices to enter the cloister, driven by a variety of personal, intellectual, spiritual, and even strategic motivations. The idea of widespread involuntary cloistering for medieval women is largely a romanticized and often inaccurate portrayal, overlooking the genuine agency and diverse reasons that led women to embrace monastic life. For many women in the medieval period, entering a nunnery was a deliberate and often highly desirable choice, offering a compelling alternative to the often restrictive options available in secular society. Primary path for women outside the cloister was marriage, which, particularly for women of noble or wealthy families, was frequently an arranged alliance dictated by family strategy, economic considerations, or political ambition. Such marriages could be fraught with challenges, including early childbirth, high mortality rates, the risks of spousal abuse, and the loss of personal autonomy to a husband and his family. In contrast, the convent offered a unique space where a woman could exercise a significant degree of control over her own life. Within the monastic community, women found opportunities for intellectual pursuit, for spiritual growth, for leadership, and for a form of communal living that often provided companionship and support. For women who were disinclined towards marriage, or who sought a life dedicated to study and prayer, the cloister presented an attractive and legitimate path, chosen freely and with conviction. Furthermore, the convent offered unparalleled opportunities for education and intellectual engagement that were largely unavailable to women in secular life. While some noble women might receive private tutoring, and wealthy urban women might gain basic literacy, formal education beyond rudimentary skills was rare for women outside religious institutions. Within nunneries, however, literacy was often a prerequisite for participation in the divine office, and many convents maintained impressive libraries and scriptoria, fostering environments of scholarship and learning. Women who desired to read, to write, to engage with theology, philosophy, or even medicine and natural sciences, found a sanctuary for their intellectual curiosities within the cloister. The lives of celebrated intellectuals like Hildegard of Bingen, Atzvit of Gandersheim, or Herod of Landsberg, all of whom were highly educated. Abbesses who composed significant literary, musical, and theological works, stand as powerful testaments to the intellectual freedom and scholarly opportunities in intellectual freedoms. Their achievements were not exceptions, but rather shining examples of a broader intellectual culture, fostered within many nunneries, attracting women who valued knowledge and intellectual pursuits above all else. Beyond intellectual aspirations, a profound spiritual calling was undoubtedly a major driving force for many women entering nunneries. The medieval world was deeply religious, and for sincere believers, the monastic life offered the most direct and dedicated path to salvation and communion with God. Women who felt a strong spiritual vocation, who desired a life consecrated to prayer, contemplation, and service, found the convent to be the ideal environment for their spiritual journey. This genuine piety was not a rarity. Countless narratives and spiritual writings from the period attest to the sincere devotion of many nuns, who embraced their vows with joy and profound conviction. The desire to live a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience was often a deeply personal and meaningful decision, representing a heartfelt commitment to their faith rather than a forced imposition. For these women, the cloister was not a prison, but a sanctuary, a place where they could truly live out their spiritual ideals. Moreover, for some women, particularly widows or those who had lost their families, the convent offered a secure and respectable refuge. A widow in medieval society could find herself in a precarious position, dependent on relatives or facing economic hardship. The convent provided a stable community, a roof over her head, and a sense of purpose, offering an alternative to remarriage or a life of vulnerability. Similarly, for women who, for whatever reason, did not marry, the convent offered a respected and socially acceptable status, rather than leaving them as isolated spinsters dependent on family charity. This aspect of monastic life as a social safety net, while not driven purely by spiritual devotion, still represented a choice made by women seeking security and dignity rather than a forced confinement. The agency involved here is in actively seeking out this alternative, recognizing it as a more desirable option than others available to them. Finally, while instances of daughters being placed in convents by their families against their expressed will might have occurred, they were likely the exception rather than the rule. Such forced placements would have undermined the very spiritual purpose of the convent and could lead to significant internal disruption. Monastic rules often required a genuine vocation and a period of novitiate to test the candidate's sincerity and suitability for the religious life. While a family might exert pressure, the ultimate decision to take vows was ideally a personal one, and convents generally preferred candidates who were truly committed to their chosen path. The widespread notion of women being routinely sent away against their wishes largely ignores the active and often joyous choices made by countless medieval women who found in the nunnery a fulfilling life of purpose, intellectual growth, and spiritual devotion. A world far richer and more complex than the simplistic narrative of forced cloistering, Number 4. Nuns were entirely cut off from the outside world and had no influence. Perception that medieval nuns lived in complete isolation, entirely cut off from the affairs of the secular world and therefore devoid of any real influence, is a pervasive misconception. This view suggests that the cloister acted as an impermeable barrier, sealing off its inhabitants from society, politics, and daily life, rendering them passive and powerless figures on the periphery of history. Such a narrow interpretation fails to acknowledge the multifaceted ways in which nunneries and their residents were deeply interconnected with and often exerted significant influence over the broader medieval world. Far from being isolated enclaves, many nunneries were vibrant centers of power, learning, and social interaction, with abbesses and their communities playing crucial roles in local, regional, and even national affairs, demonstrating a level of engagement and authority that defies the image of complete detachment. One of the most significant ways in which nunneries exerted influence was through their economic power and land management. Many medieval convents, particularly the larger and older Benedictine foundations, were substantial landowners, possessing vast estates, manors, and even entire villages. The abbess of such an institution was not merely a spiritual leader. She was a powerful feudal lord, responsible for managing these extensive properties, overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents and tithes, and administering justice within her domains. This meant dealing with tenants, hiring bailiffs, negotiating with merchants, and engaging in legal disputes, all of which required considerable administrative skill, shrewd business acumen, and a deep understanding of economic realities. The abbess of Quedlinburg in Germany, for example, held princely status within the Holy Roman Empire, wielding secular authority over a significant territory, issuing coinage, and even raising troops. Such a position clearly demonstrates that these women were not only not cut off from the world, but actively engaged in its most tangible and powerful aspects, demonstrating formidable temporal authority typically associated with male feudal lords. Beyond economic power, nunneries served as vital spiritual and cultural centers, attracting pilgrims, patrons, and scholars from far and wide. Many convents housed relics of saints, becoming popular pilgrimage destinations that brought revenue, visitors, and renown to the community. These institutions often maintained guest houses, offering hospitality to travelers, including royalty, noblewomen, and other clergy. Such interactions provided avenues for the exchange of news, ideas, and political intelligence, ensuring that the nuns were well informed about secular affairs. Moreover, convents often acted as centers of learning and artistic patronage, commissioning manuscripts, religious artifacts, and architectural projects. Wealthy families and rulers would often donate to nunneries, not just for spiritual merit, but also to solidify their own social standing and ensure prayers for their souls, thereby creating a reciprocal relationship that integrated the convent into the broader social fabric of patronage and obligation. The spiritual authority of abbesses and individual nuns also gave them considerable influence. Abbesses were often sought out as spiritual advisors by lay aristocrats, including queens and empresses who valued their wisdom, piety, and perceived closeness to God. Letters and historical accounts reveal instances of powerful women seeking counsel from abbesses on matters of faith, morality, and even political strategy. The spiritual guidance offered by these cloistered women was highly esteemed, providing them with an informal yet significant voice in the lives of the powerful. In some cases, nuns, particularly those known for their sanctity or prophetic visions like Hildegard of Bingen, corresponded directly with emperors, popes, and kings, offering advice, warnings, and pronouncements that held considerable weight in the political and religious discourse of their time. Hildegard's extensive correspondence, where she admonished rulers and offered political commentary, vividly illustrates a nun's profound engagement with and influence on the secular world, shattering any notion of her being completely isolated. Nunneries also played crucial roles in local communities, acting as providers of social services that integrated them deeply into daily life. Many convents ran schools for girls, educating not only their own novices, but also the daughters of local gentry and townspeople, thus shaping the intellectual and moral development of future generations of women. They often maintained infirmaries and cared for the sick, offering medical aid that was otherwise scarce. Some convents provided charitable assistance to the poor, distributing food or clothing, and many served as orphanages, offering shelter and care to abandoned children. These vital social functions made nunneries indispensable parts of their local communities, fostering strong ties with the lay population and giving the nuns a practical, tangible influence over the welfare of those around them. The everyday interactions with villagers, peasants, and townspeople who relied on the convent's services clearly demonstrate that nuns were not removed from society, but were integral to its functioning. Finally, familial connections ensured that nuns were never truly isolated from the outside world. Daughters of noble families might enter the cloister, but their families did not forget them. Visits from relatives, correspondence, and continued financial support flowed between the convent and the secular world. These familial ties meant that nuns were often privy to news and gossip, and their insights or concerns might even be conveyed back to their influential families. In many cases, the convent became a significant part of the family's legacy, with subsequent generations continuing to support the institution or even joining its ranks. This ongoing interaction, whether through formal visits, written communication, or the continuous flow of gifts and donations, ensured a constant interplay between the cloistered community and the secular society, proving that medieval nuns, far from being isolated, remained deeply connected to and influential within the broader medieval world. Number 5. Nuns were uneducated and spent all their time in prayer. The widespread belief that medieval nuns were largely uneducated and spent the entirety of their lives in unceasing prayer, with no engagement in intellectual pursuits or practical matters, severely underestimates. This misconception often reduces the rich tapestry of a nun's existence to a singular repetitive act, portraying convents as places devoid of intellectual rigor or any form of scholarly endeavor. However, historical evidence unequivocally demonstrates that many nunneries were centers of learning, intellectual hubs, where women not only acquired significant knowledge but also contributed substantially to the literary, theological. The idea that their days were filled exclusively with prayer neglects the extensive time dedicated to study, copying, teaching, writing, and the myriad administrative and artistic tasks that defined their daily routines, promoting a level of education and engagement far beyond simple devotional repetition. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against the notion of uneducated nuns lies in the very structure of monastic life itself. The regular recitation of the divine office, the daily cycle of prayers, psalms, and readings required a high degree of literacy. Nuns needed to be able to read Latin, the liturgical language, and often understand complex theological texts. This meant that literacy, at least in Latin, was a fundamental requirement for full participation in convent life. Unlike many laywomen who might be illiterate or only have rudimentary literacy in their vernacular language, nuns were trained to read and comprehend sacred texts, ensuring that the spiritual practices that formed the core of their day were rooted in understanding, not rote memorization alone. The very act of singing psalms and hymns from written scores also implies a level of musical literacy and training, further debunking the idea of an uneducated existence. Beyond mere literacy, many convents functioned as significant centers of scholarship and education, cultivating environments where intellectual pursuits were actively encouraged and valued. Convents often maintained impressive libraries, housing not only religious texts, but also classical literature, philosophical treatises, and even scientific works. Nuns were responsible for the preservation and dissemination of knowledge through the painstaking process of copying manuscripts in the convent scriptorium. This highly skilled work involved hours of meticulous transcription, requiring accuracy, linguistic proficiency, and an intimate familiarity with the texts. Through this process, nuns became conduits of knowledge, ensuring that ancient wisdom and contemporary thought were preserved for future generations. The act of copying was not a passive one. It involved engagement with the text, often leading to deep understanding and personal reflection on the material, further expanding their intellectual horizons. Moreover, nunneries were often places where women not only consumed knowledge, but also produced it. Many nuns were accomplished authors, poets, dramatists, and theologians, creating original works that left an indelible mark on medieval culture. The remarkable figure of Hrotsvit of Gandersheim, a 10th century Benedictine nun from Saxony, stands as a towering example. She is widely considered the first female playwright in the Western world, composing 6 Latin plays modeled after the Roman playwright Terence, but with Christian themes aiming to promote virtue and chastity. Her works reveal a profound knowledge of classical literature, a sophisticated command of Latin, and a keen understanding of dramatic structure. Hutfit also wrote historical narratives and poems, demonstrating a breadth of intellectual interests that spanned secular and sacred subjects. Her ability to engage with and transform classical literary forms into a Christian context chains a level of education and creative genius that thoroughly contradicts any notion of unlettered monastic life. Another unparalleled example of a medieval nun's intellectual prowess is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess, mystic, composer, philosopher, and polymath. Hildegard's achievements are staggering, encompassing theology, music, natural science, and medicine. She authored numerous books, including Scivias, a record of her theological visions, Physica, a text on natural history, and Causae et Curae, a work on medicine and healing. Her compositions, collected in the Symphonia Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum, are among the most extensive and sophisticated bodies of plain cant from the Middle Ages. Hildegard corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering spiritual advice and admonitions, demonstrating her influence and the respect commanded by her intellect. Her work required not just religious devotion but also a profound understanding of classical knowledge, contemporary scientific thought, and an extraordinary capacity for original synthesis. Her existence alone shatters the stereotype of the uneducated nun, revealing a woman who was a formidable scholar and an intellectual force in her own right, challenging the boundaries of knowledge in her era. Beyond these exceptional individuals, many convents also served as schools for girls, educating not only their own novices but often the daughters of local nobility and gentry. This role as educators meant that nuns possessed the necessary pedagogical skills and knowledge to impart instruction in Latin, arithmetic, music, and various domestic arts. The fact that they were teaching others fundamentally implies that they themselves were educated, capable of transmitting complex information and fostering intellectual growth in their students. This educational function further cemented the nunneries' role as centers of learning, actively shaping the intellectual development of women in medieval society. While prayer was undoubtedly a central component of a nun's life, it was intricately interwoven with a rich tapestry of intellectual activity, scholarly pursuits, and administrative responsibilities. The daily routine of a medieval nun was a careful balance of devotional practice, disciplined study, creative endeavor, and the practical management of their communities, making the idea of them being uneducated and solely engaged in prayer a profound mischaracterization of their diverse and intellectually rich lives.